Good afternoon. My name is Ricardo Ibáñez, and this is RICARDO'S Time. Today we will talk about businessmen, and I'm here with Martin Hooss. Welcome, Martin.
Thanks for having me again, Ricardo.
My pleasure. He's the philosophical advisor of RICARDO'S Time. So, Martin, I would like to know why businessmen are so hated by so many people. Why people think they are evil.
You know, when you look at today's society, there is a lot of reason to hate businessmen, actually. But the point is that actually the problem is that businessmen, which are seen today, are not the true businessmen whom I personally admire. The point is that we no longer live in a capitalist society. When you look back in history, and I will come to that in a second, those early businessmen who succeeded on sheer ability are the greatest heroes of mankind, probably. However, if you look at more recent phenomena of the businessman, we are not dealing with people anymore who act on the free market, who take and invest their capital in order to profit all of us because they initiate progress. What we are seeing today is cronyism. We no longer live under capitalism, we no longer have a free market, we have government intervention into the economy. So a lot of people hate the businessman, but what they truly hate are what you might call bureaucratic businessmen. So those are people who don't become famous or important or influential because they have built a product, but because they have government pull. So they are there because of government privileges, government handouts, they have no ability whatsoever, and they are ruining the economy. So this is a problem. However, when you step back in history, and when you, for instance, look at the 19th century, which was the freest century of all time, especially in the United States after the birth of capitalism, and so on and so forth. What we are seeing here is people who succeeded on sheer ability. You can study very much any field you want. Rand, of course, famously studied the railroads. And what she found out, as you can read still in some of her articles in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, is what she found out during her research, that those businessmen who did not take the government handout built all those railroads, which we're still having until this day, from which we're all profiting. But at the same time, at this point in history, in the 19th century, the first collectivists were coming to the United States, and they were undermining the Constitution because the Constitution was not perfect. They found loopholes in the Constitution, and consequently they were able to step-by-step get government handouts. This became much more extreme, of course, in the 1930s with Roosevelt and with the New Deal reforms. So suddenly we had people whom you cannot really describe as businessmen. But those people are rightfully hated. But if you define your terms clearly, and if you look at the early businessman, whom I consider as the only adequate, correct businessman, then I think those people are certainly not evil. And in today's society, it is very hard to differentiate the good from the evil businessman because of the system which has been set up. In effect, every businessman has to take the government handout. Most of them are gray cases. So the best we can do is figure out the white and the black elements and then reach an estimate. Now, one more quick thing I would like to say as a side note is the following. When you study the progress of nations, and this is the big question of economic theory and economic history, goes all the way back, of course, to Adam Smith. 1776, he wrote The Wealth of Nations. And the question in that book is, why do some countries become rich and others stagnate? Now, a lot of hypotheses have been put forth. Some of them, including Adam Smith, looked at geography and said, if you look at the coastlines, you will see that if you have access to an ocean or to an important river, you will grow rich. If you are landlocked, you have problems. Others later said it's institutions. Others again said it's ideas, and so on and so forth. But there are some very interesting economics, Frank Knight, I would mention first, who pointed out that if you look at the development of countries, that the number of businessmen, and businessmen in the real sense of the word here, the number of businessmen correlates with the wealth of a nation. For instance, if you have a free nation which becomes more collectivist, then the businessmen will step by step disappear and the GDP will fall. And on the other hand, if a country becomes more liberal in the best sense of the term, and if it has more pro-free market reforms, then in such a case there will be more businessmen, there will be more progress. So there is a clear correlation. If we look at the businessmen whom I admire, we need those people, and those are the greatest heroes of mankind. In addition, of course, what we are seeing today, that's my last point because I'm talking too much as always, the last point here is also morality, which we need to talk about. There is an altruist morality here, which has always existed, which says that you are evil if you make a profit. But the point here is that those people need to make a profit. They are accumulating the capital which we need in the economy, which needs to be invested. We can never forget that consumption is necessarily a dead end. Everything which is consumed is gone, but everything which the businessman is invested, that we can profit from, all of us, later. And ultimately, if a businessman who built a skyscraper dies, the skyscraper is still there. And it's still an advantage for many people.
Exactly, and that's my next point that I would like you to elaborate, which is people think, this is another aspect, right? People think that businessmen are evil because they are selfish, supposedly selfish, and because they look for their own interests, for their own benefits at the expense of others. Could you talk a little more about this?
Well, first and foremost, every successful businessman has to be selfish. You know, Steve Jobs did not invent the iPhone because he wanted to make people happy. No, he wanted to make money. And also, of course, those people who are the real inventors and also the businessmen, they do invent stuff because they take selfish pleasure from that. They like the challenge and they want to break through barriers. They want to innovate. This is their passion. If someone were to set out and say, I have no passion for what I'm doing, I just want to please my fellow brothers, such a person would not achieve anything. That selfishness, and we're talking about rational selfishness, is the motor, the catalyst of the entrepreneur and also of a booming economy. Because the point here is as follows. When people hear selfishness, they mean, well, you know, the businessmen are exploiting the poor and the entrepreneurs are exploiting the proletarians. Very Marxist notions, which we hear especially in academia today. Now, that is certainly not true. You know, the Marxist theory has been refuted over and over again, because if you leave the businessman free, everyone will profit. It's not the case that we have a fixed pie in the economy, by which I mean that we have a certain amount of money in the economy. If a businessman takes out 24, there will only be 76% left. This is not true. You know, if you leave the businessman free, that pie from which we all profit will get bigger and bigger and bigger. And everyone, including the very poorest, will profit. This is the point here. But why is this the case? Well, ultimately, if the businessmen are free, they can follow their own rational self-interest. This has nothing to do with exploiting other people. What those people need to do, they need to be free in a free environment on the free market to use their minds to the best of their ability. And you can only do that under a fully free capitalist system. They come up with new ideas, that's the intellectual part, and then they need to give them form, that is the practical part. And ultimately, if they bring out those products, everyone profits. You know, I could not have invented the iPhone. I'm very happy that I have one, and I'm very happy that I can buy it as a consumer, but I can only buy it because Steve Jobs was free to create that product.
Absolutely, it makes our life better. Uber, Amazon, they all put our life in a higher quality. So I would like to ask you, why businessmen need philosophy?
Businessmen need philosophy much more than is generally recognized. And of course, Ayn Rand talked a lot about that, you know. Very much after Atlas Shrugged, she wrote this brilliant essay for the New Intellectual, which is incredibly important and which she talks about at over 50 pages. Also remember that that was the last topic Rand addressed in her life. That is what she spoke about in New Orleans 4 months before her death in her last public lecture. So it was a terribly important subject for Rand, and I also think it is probably more than ever today. And why is that so? We just talked about the fact that we are only so well off because the people, the businessmen, can pursue their own rational self-interest. Now, unfortunately, a lot of businessmen, probably 90% plus, have accepted the altruist morality, which means that they have no right to their own product, that they are, in effect, sacrificial animals who need to sacrifice themselves for the common good, for the public. Now, this leads to problems. First of all, a lot of young people no longer want to go into business because they don't accept that code, but they don't know what to do at the same time because they haven't found the right morality yet. Plus, you have, of course, all the political impediments and hindrances which are put in their way through taxation. So all of that leads to problems. But the point here is, if you want to become a successful entrepreneur, you need to have self-esteem. You need to trust yourself. You need to be rational. You need to believe in yourself and in your product, know how to make it better, know how to deal with challenges. And ultimately, you want to make a profit. That is the point why you are going into business. If that is taken away from the people, they will no longer produce. And I think a lot of businessmen also who have acted for some time on the right premise, when they were young and ambitious and on fire, they ultimately sell out. I think a great example, which we could talk about here, is Bill Gates. Because Bill Gates made our lives so much better, like almost no one else in the 1990s, when he was acting like a businessman, like an entrepreneur. Like, what has Bill Gates done in the last 15 years since he has accepted the altruist morality that he has to sacrifice for other people? Again, I said it 5 minutes ago, consumption is a dead end. And Bill Gates is just throwing around with money which is ultimately no longer invested, which is just spent and squandered. I mean, he has a right to do that if he wants to do it, but if he had a better morality of life, he would invest that and we would all be better off. Plus, of course, Bill Gates is also very much involved in politics these days, which is a different issue, but I think equally evil.
I think we need more millionaires, but from the good ones, right? Which are really few.
Well, you know, the bad millionaires, if you want to put it that way, let us say someone who just inherits a lot of money, let us say 10 million, is not really a problem, you know. Just don't redistribute the money. Because if the person is not worthy of the money, they will squander it and then it's gone anyway. So it is not really a problem.
So we should thank millionaires for being millionaires. Can you give me an example of a good millionaire?
Well, you know, thanking millionaires, I would not put it in that term, but I would say if you are at home and if you are happy with a product you bought, I think you should just feel grateful for a moment for those people. But ultimately, you know, you shouldn't be on your knees all day like in a religious sect or whatsoever and just pray to the businessman or whatsoever. But I think if you meet them in person, yes, if they have really helped you, then yes, by giving you a product which you need. Of course, if someone is a millionaire and has invented something you do not need, let us say you don't care for music and someone has invented a tool which really helps you to become a better guitar player, why should you thank that particular businessman? You can admire him in general principles for the principles he upholds, but the product itself is useless for you as a person because it doesn't relate to your values. But I think if you meet a businessman in person who has helped you or who has given you a product which is helpful to you, then yes. And my personal example, of course, is my good friend Carl Barney, who is a multimillionaire from the US and who has helped me so much in my career. And if he hadn't done so, I would not sit here today. But the point is that Carl himself, he needed to keep that money. Had the government taken away the money from him, then he could not invest it in upcoming intellectuals and entrepreneurs and make the world such a better place.
So could we say that Ayn Rand's philosophy, objectivism, is the philosophy for entrepreneurs?
More than anything else, yes. And why is that so? If you look at Rand's philosophical system in a nutshell, I cannot summarize the entire philosophical system now, but what she says is be reality oriented. Use your mind to understand the world. And what a businessman does is he uses his mind in order to figure out what shortcomings are there. What are the product people need? Do I want to build that? Yes or no? Then it goes to ethics, you know. How should I lead my business? And you need to be rational in order to create a product. You need to think independently, to think what you want to create. You need to have integrity, not to give up. You need to be proud of your actions in order to develop the self-esteem, and so on and so forth. And consequently, of course, since Rand is in favor of laissez-faire capitalism, which means a complete separation of the economy from politics, this is the only system under which businessmen can flourish. Then, of course, we still have aesthetics, way too often neglected, which is about romanticism. It is ultimately about creating also not things as they are, but about doing something innovative and doing something inspiring. And I think art, on the one hand, can help the businessman to recreate his soul. And on the other hand, also, there are a lot of businessmen involved in arts. And I think in such cases also, when you have businessmen who are also painters or who work with painters, that connection is also very important. And maybe at another time we can also talk about the connection of art and politics, because that's also a very fascinating topic.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin, for your answers. It was a pleasure having you here again. And how is your time here in Cuzco? Are you enjoying?
Oh, I'm always enjoying being in Peru, and Cuzco, of course, is a wonderful place. And I'm very much looking forward to returning to Machu Picchu.
It was a great episode, so see you in the next one, which is going to be about mysticism. This was Ricardo's Time. See you next time. Thank you.